In the summer of 1942, deep in the smoking fields of eastern Ukraine, a German recovery team came across something that would leave even the most confident Panzer officers silent. The machine stood partly buried in the mud, its thick armor blackened by fire, but its shape unmistakable, wide, squat, and defiant. It wasn't German. It wasn't even European in design. It was Soviet, a T-34. The Wehrmacht had heard rumors about these new Soviet tanks since Operation Barbarossa began a year earlier, but now, for the first time, they were close enough to touch one. And what they saw would change everything the German High Command believed about armored warfare. The T-34 they found was one of the early production models, likely from the Kharkov factory. The engine was seized from battle damage, but the chassis was intact. The sloped armor glistened under the sun, not the flat, rigid surfaces of the German Panzer III or IV, but a design built to deflect shells rather than absorb them. A young German lieutenant, Hans Graber, ran his hand along the steel and muttered, "It's primitive." His superior, Major Becker, frowned. Primitive? He banged his fist against the turret. The sound echoed, dull and dense. "This," he said quietly, "is genius." Within weeks, the captured T-34 was sent to the Kummersdorf testing grounds near Berlin, the same facility where German engineers tested every tank, plane, and artillery piece captured from enemy forces. The engineers were stunned. For years, German design philosophy had focused on precision, perfectly fitted gears, exact tolerances, and custom-machined components. The T-34 was the opposite. Its parts were crude, roughly welded, sometimes asymmetrical. But it worked. It was simple to build, simple to repair, and almost impossible to stop. Reports from the Eastern Front began to mirror that discovery. German tank commanders complained that their shells bounced off T-34s even at close range. A Panzer III with a 50mm gun couldn't penetrate its armor unless it fired from behind or the sides, a near suicidal position in battle. Meanwhile, the T-34's 76.2mm gun could knock out a Panzer IV from over 1,000 meters away. By October 1942, German engineers had compiled a 42-page report titled Erfahrungen mit dem russischen T-34 Tank, Experiences with the Russian T-34 tank. It described the tank as the best in the world, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. The heart of that simplicity was the V2 diesel engine, an aluminum block powerhouse producing 500 horsepower. At Kummersdorf, the German technicians tried to dismantle it, expecting rough Soviet workmanship. But what they found was something extraordinary, a perfect balance between raw functionality and industrial efficiency. It wasn't beautiful, but it was brilliant. One engineer wrote in disbelief, "We could not reproduce this engine in our factories without first retooling entire production lines." And that was the problem. Germany couldn't mass produce a tank like the T-34, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked the industrial mindset. German manufacturing was built on craftsmanship. Every Panzer Tiger or Panther was an engineering marvel, but each required thousands of man-hours and specialized materials. In contrast, the Soviets had built the T-34 for total war. They could assemble one in less than a week, even in factories moved to the Ural Mountains under bombing raids. By late 1942, Hitler personally ordered that the new Panther tank be developed as a direct response to the T-34. Designers from MAN and Daimler-Benz raced to replicate what they had learned from the captured Soviet tank. They copied the sloped armor, the wide tracks, the suspension system, but they couldn't copy its simplicity. The first Panther prototypes were ready by early 1943, and they were magnificent, powerful, intimidating, and technologically superior in almost every way. But when Operation Citadel began in July 1943, the Battle of Kursk, reality hit hard. Over half of the new Panthers broke down before even reaching the battlefield. Fuel leaks, engine fires, transmission failures, the consequences of rushing an over-engineered machine into mass production. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34s rolled in endless columns, burning fuel that could be poured from a tractor, repaired in the field by soldiers with wrenches and hammers. The Germans were shocked. The machine they had mocked for being peasant-built was now the standard of modern warfare. At Kummersdorf, German engineers continued testing captured models throughout 1943 and 1944. They even painted one T-34 with Balkenkreuz markings and used it for mock battles. In one test, a German officer remarked bitterly, "We can build 10 masterpieces, or they can build 100 hammers. In war, the hammers win." By mid-1944, as Allied bombing crippled German industry, that truth became undeniable. Factories that once prided themselves on perfection now struggled just to maintain supply chains. Steel shipments dwindled, machine tools wore out, and skilled workers were drafted into the army. The Reich could no longer afford masterpieces. Meanwhile, Soviet production reached unimaginable levels. Between 1940 and 1945, over 57,000 T-34s rolled off the assembly lines, compared to just 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. The difference wasn't just quantity, it was philosophy. Germany believed in quality through precision. The Soviets believed in victory through practicality. The captured T-34 still sat at Kummersdorf in 1945, abandoned as the war drew to its brutal end. When American troops finally entered the facility that April, they found the tank still standing, its armor scarred but intact, a silent reminder of the moment Germany realized it was fighting the wrong kind of war. A U.S. Army technician reportedly laughed when he saw the test logbook. The last entry, dated February 12, 1945, read simply, "We still cannot produce such a machine in our current system." He looked up from the page and said quietly, "That's why they lost."
When Berlin fell in May 1945, the war that began with precision and pride ended in rubble and silence. In those final months, as the Soviet army advanced through East Prussia and Brandenburg, T-34s rolled through shattered German towns like symbols of an industrial truth Germany had refused to accept. For the men who had studied the captured tank at Kummersdorf, its rumble was a haunting sound, familiar, inevitable, and final. In July 1945, Allied technical intelligence teams began cataloging every captured document and piece of machinery the Germans had left behind. Among the stacks of blueprints and test logs, one report caught the attention of an American colonel attached to the Technical Intelligence Division. It was stamped Geheime Kommandoschaffe, top secret command matter. Inside were the full test results of the Soviet T-34 from 1942 to 1944, complete with performance charts, ballistic tests, and maintenance evaluations. The report concluded with a single sentence that stunned the Americans. If we possessed the Soviet manufacturing methods, we could win any industrial war. That realization wasn't lost on the victors. The United States, already deep into demobilization, sent copies of the German analysis to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, engineers compared it with data from their own tests of captured Soviet tanks obtained through Lend-Lease and post-war exchanges. By late 1946, a quiet consensus emerged among American and British tank designers. The Soviets had created the world's first truly modern tank. At the same time, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet engineers were already moving forward. In 1947, the T-54 prototype appeared, sleeker, heavier, and deadlier than the T-34. It inherited the same philosophy: thick, sloped armor, low profile, wide tracks, and simple mass production. The world entered the age of practical engineering, and the T-34 was its blueprint. But the irony didn't end there. Many of the German engineers who had once tested the T-34 at Kummersdorf were now working for the Allies under Operation Paperclip and its Soviet counterpart, Operation Ossow-Yakim. Men like Heinrich Knipkamp, who had overseen the Panzer design programs, were quietly advising Western tank projects. Their reports repeatedly referred to the T-34, not with contempt, but with respect. In a 1948 debriefing, Knipkamp told a British officer, "We admired it more than we admitted. It was the only tank of the war that did everything reasonably well." Those words echoed across design rooms in Detroit, Birmingham, and Moscow. Every major tank built after 1945, the American M48 Patton, the British Centurion, the Soviet T-54, bore the ghost of that captured T-34. What Germany had failed to build during the war, the world built after it. Meanwhile, in occupied Germany, a new generation of engineers faced a different challenge. They were rebuilding factories, not for tanks, but for tractors, locomotives, and industrial equipment. And in those machines, the lessons of the T-34 lived on. At a manufacturing conference in Essen in 1951, a West German engineer, formerly a Wehrmacht mechanic, was asked about wartime efficiency. He paused and said, "The Russians built things that worked. We built things that impressed. That was our mistake." Across the border in East Germany, Soviet advisors established tank production facilities at Eisenach and Magdeburg, where stripped-down versions of the T-34 were assembled under license. Thousands of former Wehrmacht workers found themselves building the very machine that had once defeated them. By 1955, the NVA East German Army fielded over 1,200 T-34-85s, tanks built by German hands under Soviet supervision. It was history's ultimate irony. The tank Germany couldn't build in war had become the one it built in peace for its occupiers. But beyond the Cold War politics, the T-34's real impact was philosophical. It changed how the world thought about technology and war. Before the T-34, engineers believed victory came from superior design. After the T-34, they understood victory came from superior production. That shift reshaped every military industry in the post-war world. Factories stopped chasing perfection and started chasing efficiency. Steel quality became standardized, assembly lines became modular, maintenance became field-friendly. When American forces entered Korea in 1950 and faced T-34s again, they saw the full circle of history. Some of the same models that had rolled through Berlin were now fighting U.S. troops at the Pusan perimeter. A U.S. tank commander later said, "It's not fancy, but it's everywhere. You knock one out, two more show up." That was the exact nightmare the Germans had faced in 1943, and the exact lesson they'd written in their Kummersdorf report. By the 1960s, both NATO and Warsaw Pact tanks carried the DNA of the T-34. Sloped armor became standard, wide tracks became essential, diesel engines became universal. Even the concept of field repair, swapping entire components instead of fixing them on the spot, came directly from Soviet doctrine born in 1941. At a Cold War symposium in 1974, a retired U.S. general summarized it perfectly. The T-34 didn't just win a war, it rewrote the manual on how to build for one. And yet, for all its influence, the original captured T-34 at Kummersdorf remained forgotten, a relic buried in reports and memories. When historians finally uncovered its test logbook in 1992, stored in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, the entries read like a diary of reluctant admiration. One final note, dated March 1945, stood out. "This tank represents the enemy's true strength, not his men, not his spirit, but his factories. Today, replicas of that same T-34 stand in museums across Europe. Visitors walk past the thick armor, the sloped steel, the crude welds, not realizing that this humble machine humbled one of history's most technologically advanced armies. The German engineers who once dismissed it as crude were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. War doesn't reward perfection. It rewards endurance. The T-34 was never the prettiest, never the most complex, but it was the one that could be built, driven, and repaired by anyone, anywhere. And in total war, that was the only perfection that mattered. As one former Wehrmacht mechanic said during a veterans interview in 1998, his voice trembling with honesty, "We didn't lose to better soldiers. We lost to better factories." That single captured tank, examined, misunderstood, and quietly admired, had become more than a weapon. It became a teacher, and its lessons still echo in every armored vehicle that rolls across the world today.